So today we're going to start talking about classification, which is basically just organizing life's diversity. So why do we classify organisms? Well, when organisms are classified, they're basically organized and grouped according to their similarities. So we look for similarities in the organism, and then we try to group them as scientists. The branch of biology that deals with classification and naming of living things is called taxonomy. There are currently between 1.5 and 1.8 million named species in the world, and about half are actually insects. No one knows how many species are still to be discovered. So that means we have about, on our planet, 3 to 100 million, and this range indicates how little we actually know about our biodiversity. Taxonomy also helps biologists to establish evolutionary relationships among organisms, meaning that they can figure out how organisms have evolved over time or how certain DNA has been able to help organisms survive in specific environments. So what characteristics are used by taxonomists when they classify organisms? Well, we have structural, which is also known as morphology. This is going to be like the cell type. Remember, we learned about prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. We also look at the body plan and skeleton type. And you know that from evolution, skeleton type could be the analogous structures, the vestigial structures, and of course, your homologous structures. Then we have functional. So we're talking about autotrophs, heterotrophs, which we started talking about when we were learning about plants. Remember, plants are autotrophs, we humans are heterotrophs. And the type of metabolism, anaerobic or aerobic. Remember, aerobic has to do with oxygen, anaerobic means without. We also went over that when we were talking about the different types of cells. Embryological, that is the pattern of embryonic development. So what an embryo looks like as it slowly begins to develop into the organism. Biochemical, that is the DNA-based sequencing. Remember, all organisms have the same bases, but they could be in different orders, or specific sections could be silenced, which means they're turned off for that organism. And then the amino acid sequencing, which we went over when we covered DNA and protein synthesis. So what's the history of classification? Well, why should we use this system? Well, classification systems are based on what is known about living things. Where we already know that there's plenty more to learn, and the more sophisticated our systems become allows us to learn more about classification, so we can learn more about living organisms. The early classification system. So more than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle developed the first widely accepted system of the biological classification. So Aristotle classified organisms as either plants or animals. And in the table, you're going to see here are some plants. We have herbs, shrubs, trees, and then some examples. And of course, animals with red blood. We have land, water, and air. So organisms that live on land, organisms that live in water, and then of course, organisms that can travel through the air. So animals were classified according to the presence or absence of red blood. Animals were further grouped according to their habitats and morphology. Remember, morphology is their structures. And plants were classified by average size and structure as trees, shrubs, or herbs. The Linnaeus system. Linnaeus's system of classification was the first formal system of taxonomy. And then we have binomial nomenclature. So Linnaeus's method of naming organisms was called binomial nomenclature, and it gives species a scientific name with two parts. The first part of the scientific name is known as the genus name. The second part is the species name, and we'll look at some examples here in just a moment. But first, let's go over some rules for writing scientific names. The first letter of the genus name is always capitalized, but the rest of the genus name and all letters of the species are lowercase. If a scientific name is written in a printed book or magazine, it should be italicized. So that means if we are typing it, it should be italicized. When a scientific name is written by hand, both parts of the name should be underlined. After the scientific name has been written completely, the genus name will be abbreviated to the first letter as it appears. And we have an example, U. americanus. So why should we use scientific names? Well, there's less confusion. So each scientific name is unique to the specific organism. The same scientific names are used by scientists all over the world, and the scientific name tells us something about the organism. Common names we know can be misleading because just like here in America, we might call an organism one name, but in another country, they call it a different name. So if we use scientific names, everybody is on the same page about which organism we are speaking of. So here we have two examples. We have a fish and we have, well, a flower. So there's different names as you see in different countries. There could be chocolate tang, mimic tang, and so on. On the right-hand side, this flower could be a dandelion. It could be a pissenlit. So the common name is going to be something that we call it in the everyday. The Latin name is the derivative for the scientific name. Taxonomic categories. So the taxonomic categories used by scientists are part of a nested hierarchical system. So there's a hierarchy. Each category is contained within another, and they are ranged from broadest to most specific. So most inclusive includes the most, to most exclusive excludes the most. So Linnaeus introduced this system for grouping species in increasingly broad categories. Each level is a named group of organisms called a taxon. First, we have the domain. It's the broadest of all the taxa and contains one or more kingdoms. So it's the most inclusive. Then we have the kingdom. It is the taxon related to the phyla or the divisions. A phylum or divisions contains related classes. A class contains related orders. An order contains related families. A family contains related genera. A genus, plural genera, is a group of species that are closely related and share the most recent common ancestor. So this is the most exclusive. Here are a couple mnemonics to remember the classification order. Dear King Paramecium cares only for green spirulina. And then there's another one, which I kind of prefer a little bit more. Kids prefer candy over fried green spinach. I'm pretty sure that's true. I don't know how many of you actually like fried green spinach. So what is a species? Not so easy to define. So in general, a species is a kind of organism. We can define them in three ways: typological, biological, phylogenetic. The typological species concept. Aristotle and Linnaeus thought of each species as a distinctly different group of organisms based on physical similarities. Based on the idea that species are unchanging, distinct, and natural types. It's limited in its usefulness because there's much variation that occurs within a species, and we know from our previous unit on evolution, there is much change in a species over time. Biological species concept. This is the second way we can look. The biological species concept defines a species as a group of organisms that is able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring in a natural setting. It applies in most cases, and it is the most frequently used. And we have some examples of the donkey, the mule, and the horse. Phylogenetic species concept. Phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species. So the phylogenetic species concept defines a species as a cluster of organisms that is distinct from other clusters and shows evidence of a pattern of ancestry and descent. This can be used for extinct species because it takes the molecular information into account. And that's talking about DNA and the nitrogenous bases. So what is a species? Well, the classification is determined by similar characteristics and the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Now, there are some limitations to each of these. So for biological species concepts, some organisms like wolves and dogs that are different species interbreed occasionally. It doesn't account for the extinct species. And then, of course, there are some benefits to each. And for the biological species concept, it is the working definition applies in most cases, so it is still the most frequently used. And finally, our classification system generally tells us how closely related organisms are. So we have the domain, which is all eukarya for the human, the chimpanzee, the dandelion, and the housefly. We have the kingdom. We see the human, the chimpanzee, and the housefly are all animals, but the dandelion is a plant. Phylum. Now we have the human and the chimpanzee. They have a chordate, which is basically a spinal cord. The class, both humans and chimpanzee are mammals. The order, both human and chimpanzee are primates. When we get to the family, we start to see the difference between human and chimpanzee. Remember, the domain is the most inclusive, which means it includes the most. The domain in this case includes the human, the chimpanzee, the dandelion, and the housefly. But when you look at the species, that's the most exclusive, and you notice that all four of our organisms are not a part of the same species.